It is concerning for me to see an important and potentially volatile relationship with China being hauled around for election time chess beating. If we were to experience conflict with China, we would surely need the support of our allies, namely America. However, last year, we saw Joe Biden extraordinarily forget the name of our own leader during a defence announcement. Does Australia need a reality check when it comes to our own sense of importance on the world stage? And are we drawing a target on our backs with the expectations of assistance from an ally who will not remember our names in the morning?
Caitlin.
Thank you. It's a really good question, Georgia. And one of the things I would say about this particular election campaign as well is that I've been really pleased to see foreign policy get more of a run, actually generate more of a debate.
But are you pleased with the debate?
But exactly. And we do risk the issue of politicising some issues that are going to be incredibly important for us over the next decade. And, you know, we are seeing an incredible shift in our strategic environment. That is not at question. China's rise, but the rise of others, is really changing the landscape. I think Australians do need to have more of a conversation about the relationship we have with the United States. It is a long-standing relationship. It has been a pillar of our foreign policy, but obviously the years under Trump, you know, really shook some of the foundations of that. We may have to step up a little bit more in our own environment and not rely as much on the United States, depending on how their political environment goes forward. I mean, I think we actually do have to think much more carefully about our relationship with China, with the rest of Asia, with the Pacific, and we've got to think about multiple issues at the same time. And this is where I think our diplomatic capability needs a huge boost. It has been underfunded and under-resourced. It's hollowed out, it's stretched thin. We don't have the capability, I would suggest, to take a robust foreign policy forward and implement that in our region.
Caitlin, is it a time for diplomacy, or is it in fact a time to, as we heard from Peter Dutton, prepare for war? Diplomacy is one thing, but is Xi Jinping in a diplomatic mind? Is Vladimir Putin in a diplomatic mind?
I mean, it's a really challenging environment we're in, there's no question, and we do have to use all the levers of statecraft that we have at our disposal. Defence is a really important part of that. I would question why we're talking about war in a national campaign. I think the rhetoric is very much shaped...
Xi Jinping is talking about war, isn't he? Directly, when he threatens to take back Taiwan by force.
He's certainly using much more aggressive language than we've seen in the past. That's absolutely right. And we have to be very prepared for a changing environment in which China is exerting more influence, more aggressively. But I would suggest that the language we've heard recently about preparing for war hasn't necessarily been helpful for Australia's reputation. It has had more of a domestic tinge. It's very much about demonstrating strength and a track record on defence. Don't get me wrong, though. I do think we need to invest in our defence capability more than we ever have before. We've got to shift our capability as well. We've got to do that while we also think about our diplomacy and our development assistance.
Campbell Newman, you served in the military. How do you see this moment right now where we've had a war in Ukraine, increasing talk of conflict out of China, a deep freeze in relations between China and the United States, talk of a new Cold China and Australia as well, and talk of a new Cold War. How do you see this moment playing out?
Look, I've been disturbed about the language from Minister Dutton in the last few days, I've got to say. Having said that, it's probably just my feeling he's gone a bit too far. He's right to actually point out that this is a very worrying time, and the most worrying time since the 1930s. But it's not all bad. I think what's happened in the Ukraine has been a very sobering lesson already to China in terms of the way the West has reacted. If you go back to the 1930s, certain dictators at the time misjudged the democracies. They felt the democracies were weak and divided and wouldn't stand up and wouldn't fight. But ultimately, that was proved wrong. And I think perhaps Mr. Putin is seeing the same thing, that it's taken a while and the people of the Ukraine have suffered terribly, but that coalition of support against the Russians has built, it has grown, and there's a determination now that perhaps I would have been surprised only a few months ago. And I think if we now turn to China, they're far more exposed. You know, Putin holds some amazing levers in terms of the energy resources that he can withhold from Western Europe, whereas China needs to sell us products. They need to sell the West products. It needs to buy raw
China, don't we? It's
exactly.
the biggest engine of economic growth.
It's a symbiotic relationship. So I guess where I land this is that there are some bright spots like that. I think it's going to make the Chinese Communist Party sit up and take notice. But I think what we need to do now, going back to what Caitlin was saying, is we need to get a defence force set up and operating in a way that's far more about self-reliance. Now, Peter Dutton's made some great announcements, but my final point is, and this is one of the things that disappoints me, 9 years of coalition government, no subs, no missiles, no frigates that have got the right capability, patrol boats that don't work properly as well. You know, you could go on and on and on.
Well,
Time's up.
I want to get a response from Stuart Robb in a minute, but Larissa Waters, I'll go to you. At a time when we've heard that we need to increase our military spending, the Greens want to reduce military spending to 1.5% of GDP and renegotiate the alliance with the United States. Why would you be renegotiating the alliance with the United States at a time when China is threatening war with Taiwan, signing security pacts with the Solomon Islands, and how is that a time to reduce military spending?
Well, I think Georgia phrased it beautifully when she pointed out that the President couldn't even remember our Prime Minister's name. It is long past time that Australia had an independent.
I think he knew. I think he may have known his name. But the question is, how do we renegotiate that at a time when increasing tensions, when we should be looking to the United States, shouldn't we, as a bedrock of security in the region?
We need an independent foreign policy that puts Australia's best interests. And we are an important player in our region, and I think we have ignored our regional responsibilities for far too long. It's probably why we've seen the Solomons enter into a pact with China, because we've cut foreign aid, we've done nothing about the climate crisis that Pacific leaders have been begging us to lead on and do better on. And we also cut the Australia network, that soft diplomacy of broadcasting and reciprocal. So it's kind of no surprise that we're now in the situation that we're in. And in some ways, I agree with Campbell. It's ironic that they've spent all this money and we still don't have anything to show.
Let's go to Stuart Robert.
You don't solve war by having more guns. The only people that benefit from war are the arms manufacturers.
Stuart Roberts, clearly 40 years until we get the nuclear-powered submarines, according to the AUKUS deal. Have we been too slow in preparing for the war that Peter Dutton's promising?
If our response on climate change is why the Solomons have gone to China, the biggest emitter in the world, I mean, it's complete nonsense. The US relationship will remain a bedrock relationship. It's widened in terms of AUKUS, in terms of Australia, UK and the United States in America. We inherited 8 years ago defence spending at 1.56% of GDP from the Labor Party. It's a statement of fact. It's now up to 2.1%. Investments are strong. Not a single military vessel boat started under Labor. Continuous shipbuilding program now, continuous. That will go forever. Across almost 52 surface and subsurface vessels. A weapons and missile program, of course, commitments now to move into a nuclear-powered boat because of the small modular reactors allowed to do it. So substantial investments. And we're right to call out the arc of influence, that unholy arc to our north. We're right to call out China's influence and what they're seeking to do. We're right to call out their economic coercion, as they're doing in terms of our trade, not just across coal exports, but across barley, across other areas, including wine. We're right to do that. We're right to call out what's happening in the Pacific Ocean. And notwithstanding your comments, which I disagree with, ma'am, we've opened 6 new embassies in the South Pacific.
There's been a bit, but we're still at the lowest of the OECD countries.
We are 50% of all development assistance in the South Pacific. We are 2/3 of all development assistance in the Solomon Islands comes from Australia. This is not an issue of neglect. This is an issue of China playing by different rules that have zero transparency in the Pacific. That's what we're facing, and it is concerning. And we should all be concerned by this, because it is going to be a challenging future in our region.
Anika, aren't there questions to be asked about Labor's consistency? When Labor was last in power, it flip-flopped on the idea of the threat from China and defence spending, going up under Kevin Rudd, coming down under Julia Gillard. We had a different approach depending on which Labor government there was. At a time when you're facing the type of challenges the world is right now, how much can Labor be relied upon?
No, I brought the receipts on this one. The government claims to have two great strengths, economic management and national security, and this week they've stuffed up both. To your question, Stan, what the government did, what Rudd-Gillard government did in
But it wasn't the Rudd-Gillard governments. It was Kevin Rudd who had one view and Julia Gillard who had another when it came to defence spending. And that's the question about inconsistency, isn't it?
Well, my understanding is that defence spending rose every year bar one across the 6 years. Foreign aid, which is a key element of our relationship with the Pacific, was cut by $250 million when the coalition came to power. Like Larissa was saying, soft power under Radio Australia was gutted under this government. For some remote islands in the Solomons, that is their major source of news, and it was cut by this coalition government. Climate change, I mean, these Pacific countries, 13 microstates, they talk about three great powers in the region. They talk about the US, they talk about China, and they talk about climate change. And this Minister of Defence was caught laughing about water lapping at their door. This government did not take their key, most existential threat seriously, and now we are suffering the consequences of it.
Stuart Roberts.
Let's look at the facts. The idea that we are suffering the consequences in the Solomon Islands because of climate change, that somehow, even though we provide 2/3 of all development assistance into the Solomon Islands, 2/3, $2.8 billion right across the board in the Pacific, $160 million per annum. In fact, the Prime Minister's first visit after the last election was to the Solomons, but apparently the Solomon Islands have chosen China because of climate change. Is just a complete and utter nonsense. We're just dealing with a different approach that China has, a lack of transparency and a different focus they've got in the South Pacific. It is of great concern. It is going to be a great challenge, and we're going to have to face up to it.
Larissa Waters, do you believe that China is a threat? Because one of your colleagues says that perhaps it's not.
I think there's still a chance to reduce a possible future threat. I think we still have
You're saying a future threat, but is China...
the advice from the expert here
is China a
in
security threat
power.
to Australia?
I
Is China
think
a security
it could
threat
become
now?
so, and we need to make sure it doesn't by
Could
doing
become
better.
so.
And what we've seen from this government, who are desperate to win an election, is to bang the drums of war to try and scare people to vote for them. It's unforgivable in my mind. Nothing that Minister Dutton has said has made any of us any safer, and he's basically just auditioning for the top job. I'm sorry, but that's how it looks to me. So this situation was avoidable, and we need infinitely more stable and sustained and sensible and peaceful approaches like the experts are recommending.
Caitlin, is a situation, I mean, we can argue about how things may have been done differently or better, but is a situation avoidable when we have seen a more assertive and expansionist China, militarising and claiming the disputed islands of the South China Sea, drawing closer to islands in the Pacific, signing the Security Pact with Solomons, threatening to invade Taiwan and reunify it? Is that Australia's fault, or are we reacting to what is right now a clear and present threat?
I think we are seeing a changing China, and our relationship with China is changing. That is very clear. And China is exerting its influence very differently right across the region and operating, much more in the zones of competition than we've ever seen before. And again, just going back to the points around defence and diplomacy and development, all of those elements of our statecraft are absolutely critical in the way that we think about how we respond to this very changing environment. And, China has a narrative that is quite appealing to many of the nations in our region, a narrative of economic development, of investment in big projects, of responsible leadership. And you just have to look at what China has done through its vaccine diplomacy. Now, we may not like it, but China is in a contest for influence, really building its influence.
Campbell Newman, you served in the Solomon Islands
Yes.
when you were in the military. Could you have seen something like this coming, and what would have been attractive to the Solomon Islands with China? Why would they be attracted to China?
Okay, well, look, it was a long time ago. It was 1988. In fact, I spent Anzac Day 1988 sitting on a coral atoll out in the Reef Islands, which is one of the most remote places you could ever go. Beautiful place, by the way. Great for divers, just a small tip there. But look, in terms of what I think the Solomon Islanders really want to see is they want hard infrastructure. That's what they really want. They want roads, they want airfields, airstrips, and that's what I was there to work on. They want landing places for barges or wharves. They want telecommunications. They want fresh water. They want sewage systems. You know, they want accommodation. That's what I think the emphasis should be, and that is where I think China that is their absolute laser-like focus when they go in to do these things. So I've got to say there seems to be some aspects, and I don't want to trivialise this, but I do note that one of the things that DFAT did for the Solomon Islands 2 years ago was help them prepare their gender equity strategy. Now, look, you know, that might be admirable, but it's actually not what a country like that probably actually sees as a top priority. But someone in DFAT thinks that's good use of our money.
I think that's an important part of an overall picture. And gender equality is actually written into the foreign policy white paper, and it's a good part.
But if you're on a head-on, this
is the point.
Well, this is a point about priorities. If you're on a head-on competition with people who actually want to deliver that stuff, which is what people really want, I don't think the average man or woman sitting in the Reef Islands or on the island of Santa Cruz are really going to say, gee whiz, isn't it great that the Australian government gave us a gender equity strategy?
I think they are, because, no, actually, you're wrong. I'm sorry, but if you look at the economic participation of women and the gap we have to fill, not just in the Pacific but across Southeast Asia, actually delivering on women's economic participation will deliver trillions into the economy.
How about okay, I'm happy to take you on that one, because I would say that actually having security, good governance, encouraging a business environment, and people will do the rest. A gender equity strategy ain't going to deliver
we need a
those
gender
outcomes.
equity strategy in Australia to begin with.
I'm not sure that Xi Jinping's pursuing a gender equity strategy either.
That's what I'm saying.
But I will to Stuart.
Remember, in terms of the Solomons,
just a final comment. We have to move on.
2/3 of all development assistance, all aid, all infrastructure is from Australia into the Solomon Islands. As a statement of fact, 66% of roads, infrastructure, support, systemic governance, overseas aid, development assistance, majority of vaccines, that's all from the Australian government, from us, from taxpayers, as part of our Pacific step-up, and that's part of the $2.8 billion. So that effort is going, Australia's already serving. And the other areas, including gender equity and so on, they're important parts of soft power, and they're important parts of developing communities, especially for mothers and for children and for care and for community and for support. But the bottom line is Australia's doing the heavy lifting. But we are in strategic competition. They are uncertain times. We have to recognise it and keep leaning in.
Stuart, the Prime Minister did criticise Labor's soft power approach this week, saying it meant more ABC and Q&A in Honiara. That wouldn't be a bad thing, I don't think, would it?
I would prefer a PM that puts Q&A in Honiara then fails to hold a hose in Honolulu.
Okay. We'll move on.
A well-rehearsed line.
We'll move on.
You inspire me.
A well-rehearsed.
You inspire me.